Good morning, everybody. I'm glad you're here. It is a relaxed day at St. Paul's and probably a relaxed day in lots of churches, but this is a good chance for us to have a kind of conversation more like a family than we would like a class. So I'm glad you're here. If you don't want to participate, that's okay. Enjoy your breakfast, enjoy your coffee. You can just ignore us. But if you'd like to participate, I've got 3 articles that I'm going to pass around for us to read and discuss. But before I do that, let me ask 2 things. First, is there a volunteer who would be willing to bounce around the room with a microphone? And I see you've all spread out beautifully so that whoever it is can really work around the room. Thank you, Kristen. I appreciate that. Here, catch. It's not on. It's not on yet. You were ready. You were ready. You were ready. The second thing I'd like to ask, or at least mention, is to say the reason we have that microphone is because this class, like our Sunday morning 8:45 and 11 o'clock services and other occasional events, is live streamed through our YouTube channel. You can access that from our website or through our Facebook feed. That's why we ask you to wait until the microphone gets, because we might be able to hear you, but surely those people who are at home in their pajamas would not be able to hear you. This morning I've already received 1 text message of gratitude for the fact that Dan Robinson and those who support him, but primarily Dan, make it possible for our services and classes to be viewed online. So a big thanks to Dan, and I'm glad that people are taking advantage of that. I've got 3 articles, one about the year as a whole, one that you might have seen in the Democrat Gazette yesterday about the hashtag #Church2 movement, and then I wanted to read a review of Pope Francis's Christmas speech and the points that he makes. But let's start with an op-ed piece from the New York Times by Nicholas Kristof. I think it became live online yesterday, but it's a part of today's Sunday Review. You might have already read it. And he wrote something really similar last year, and it stuck with me. And so I wanted to know if we might read it. I have, as that little caption will tell you on your television screen, it has been edited for content. I could not get the graphs to print very well, and I've also shortened it a little bit, but not a whole lot. But let me pass this around. And I'm putting a couple extras at some tables in case other people walk in. And let's see if we can get 2 volunteers to read this article. Would somebody read the first page, but stop before that last little bit? Stop at yesterday. Who might read that for us, please? Thank you. Julie will read that. And who will pick up with many of those moving up and read through the end of the article? Who would read the second half for us? Thank you, Karen. Julie and then Karen.
Is this working? Yeah. If you're depressed by the state of the world, let me toss out an idea. In the long arc of human history, 2019 has been the best year ever. The bad things that you fret about are true, but it's also true that since modern humans emerged about 200,000 years ago, 2019 was probably the year in which children were least likely to die, adults were least likely to be illiterate, and people were least likely to suffer excruciating and disfiguring diseases. Every single day in recent years, another 325,000 people got their first access to electricity. Each day, more than 200,000 got piped water for the first time, and some 650,000 went online for the first time every single day. Perhaps the greatest calamity for anyone is to lose a child. That used to be common. Historically, almost half of all humans died in childhood. As recently as 1950, 27% of all children still died by age 15. Now that figure has dropped to about 4%. If you were given the opportunity to choose the time you were born in, it'd be pretty risky to choose a time in any of the thousands of generations in the past, noted Max Roser, an Oxford University economist who runs the Our World in Data website. Quote, almost everyone lived in poverty, hunger was widespread, and famines common, unquote. But President Trump, but climate change, war in Yemen, starvation in Venezuela, risk of nuclear war with North Korea. All those are important concerns, and that's why I write about them regularly. Yet I fear that the news media and the humanitarian world focus so relentlessly on the bad news that we leave the public believing that every trend is going in the wrong direction. The majority of Americans say in polls that the share of the world population living in poverty is increasing. Yet one of the trends of the last 50 years has been a huge reduction in global poverty. Each day for a decade, newspapers could have carried the headline, quote, another 170,000 moved out of extreme poverty yesterday, unquote. Or if one uses a higher threshold, the headline could have been, quote, the number of people living on more than $10 a day increased by 245,000 yesterday, unquote. That's where we're supposed to stop.
Many of those moving up are still very poor, of course, but because they are less poor, they are less likely to remain illiterate or to starve. People often think that famine is routine, but the last famine recognized by the World Food Program struck just part of one state in South Sudan and lasted for only a few months in 2017. Diseases like polio, leprosy, river blindness, and elephantiasis are on the decline, and global efforts have turned the tide on AIDS. A half-century ago, a majority of the world's people had always been illiterate. Now we are approaching 90% adult literacy. There have been particularly large gains in girls' education, and few forces change the world so much as education and the empowerment of women. You may feel uncomfortable reading this. It can seem tasteless, misleading, or counterproductive to hail progress when there is still so much wrong with the world. I get that. In addition, the numbers are subject to debate, and the 2019 figures are based on extrapolation. But I worry that deep pessimism about the state of the world is paralyzing rather than empowering. Excessive pessimism can leave people feeling not just hopeless, but also helpless. Readers constantly tell me, for example, that if we save children's lives, the result will be a population crisis that will cause new famines. They don't realize that when parents are confident that their children will survive and have access to birth control, they have fewer children. Bangladesh was once derided by Henry Kissinger as a basket case, yet now its economy grows much faster than America's, and Bangladeshi women average just 2.1 births, down from 6.9 in 1973. Yes, it's still appalling that a child dies somewhere in the world every 6 seconds. But consider that just a couple of decades ago, a child died every 3 seconds. Recognizing that progress is possible can be a spur to do more, and that's why I write this annual reminder of gains against the common enemies of humanity. I also take heart from the passion so many, especially young people, show to make the world a better place. I recently published my annual Gifts with Meaning guide and suggested 4 organizations to support in lieu of traditional presents. Readers have so far donated more than $1.6 million to those organizations, saving and transforming lives at home and around the world. So I promise to tear my hair out every other day, but let's interrupt our gloom for a nanosecond to note that what historians may eventually see as the most important trend in the world in the early 21st century: our progress toward elimination of hideous diseases, illiteracy, and the most extreme poverty. When I was born in 1959, a majority of the world's population had always been illiterate and lived in extreme poverty. By the time I die, illiteracy and extreme poverty may be almost eliminated, and it's difficult to imagine a greater triumph for humanity on our watch.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Julie. What's your initial reaction to that? It's a safe place to respond in any sort of way, and I appreciate the fact that the author even says to us, you might be uncomfortable as you read this. What's your reaction, Kristen?
Relief.
Relief? Okay. Yeah.
It's true. It's true. Things are so much better now than then. And we don't like to think of it because we live in the here and now. But it's very true.
Yep. Thank you. What else? What else are your responses? Yeah, Betsy and then Barbara? Hold on a second.
Some time ago, thought I had my teacher voice, but I guess I don't. Suzanne preached a sermon similar to this, where she told of all the good things that had happened in the world recently. And I remember feeling happy for days afterwards. So I'm thinking of a priest that I knew long ago who said it's okay to be happy. That's a good thing in the world.
Thank you. Thank you. And sometimes we have to give ourselves permission, or we have to be given permission to be happy. In the face of such, as Nicholas Kristoff says, in the face of such real struggle. Yeah, Barbara.
Yes, but
yeah.
I heard on the news this week, and I won't be able to give statistics because I don't remember them, but a large percentage or a higher percentage of young people, and I guess all people in America particularly, are going away from the church these days. They're not going to church. They're going away from studying the Bible, from any worship of God. And I think that's important. That wasn't addressed in here, but I think that's important as well. And I do like what I read there.
Yeah, thank you. And I wonder what, there might not be any correlation at all, and there certainly might not be any causation or any causal relationship, but I wonder how the betterment of the world and the decline, at least in the role of organized or mainline religion in at least our country and our community and others like it. I wonder what the relationship is. Yeah, Karen.
I think there's good news and bad news here. The good news is things are getting better. I think the reason we don't hear that, as he pointed out, is that headlines don't talk about it. Newspapers are in the business of selling bad news. But I think we also can't relax just because things are getting better. Statistically, things are getting better. There's still a lot of suffering in the world.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I want to return to that in just a minute. Yes, let's all the way over here, because Kristen signed up for a workout today. Yeah.
Doesn't your question tie into the study you had a couple months ago about the preacher in Tulsa who was defrocked?
Yeah, maybe.
That the church creates the devil and scares us into coming to church?
Yeah, some people. I mean, yes, there's an observation. Yes, y'all, if you were here for that class, we were talking about. I don't know if we were talking about the end of the world or what we were talking about, but I remember it was Carson. What his name is, Pearson, the used to be televangelist, who at least started questioning the existence of hell, saying hell is the suffering around us, and sort of looked historically at what role hell and the concept of punishment, how it sort of has been curated or maintained by the church. And I wonder what that relationship is. That's a good question. Julie?
This may be anecdotal, and I don't want to get off topic, but you had said, well, what is it about our world that might be leading to some of these things with people leaving the church? And I just started Karen Armstrong's The Lost Art of Scripture this morning. I've only read like 10 pages, but it looks like it's going to be a great book. And in it, she talks, in the introduction, she talks about, the human brain has two sides. The right side, which is more focused on art and poetry and scripture and religion in her opinion, and the left side, which is more analytical. And as we've moved through the ages, we've become more focused on the left side of the brain, and we're not really developing the right side of our brain and the humanities side. And she's got a nice page that I'm probably going to take a picture of and post on Facebook describing this. So which is interesting to think about, that the humanities have kind of gotten pushed aside as we move into the AI and deep learning and other types of economies. I think.
And I haven't read it yet, but I'm fascinated with her. It's a study of how we got to where we are and how we receive Scripture, and how in several episodes of human history, we've stopped understanding the original intention of sacred story, and instead we're sort of hyper analyzing, dots and tittles, if you will. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
This story makes me start wondering what messages and what messenger am I listening to?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Absolutely. What a powerful insight, and one I feel as well. Thank you. Yeah, Richard.
Well, the sociology of religion is a thing, and there's a great YouTube channel called Religion for Breakfast, and it's a young scholar who studies religion, and he said that there's reasons for why religions die out. It has to do with credibility. If you say you believe in something and then you go around and you act the opposite way of what you say you believe, you will lose credibility and the religion will die out. And I don't think it has anything to do with increasing levels of progress. I think it has to do with the fact that we have allowed too many people to come in and kind of mess up our churches and some other religions too. And so we are sending out a big mixed message.
Okay.
So we say we do this, we believe in this one thing, but we're going to do the opposite, and it hurts us.
So let me take our conversation and come back to the article, and let me ask the question that Karen began to raise, and that the author raises as well, which is, how do you strike that balance? The author suggests that one day a year he's going to pause. We're going to pause with him for a nanosecond, he puts it, and put aside our pessimism and celebrate the accomplishments. But then we'll get right back to pulling our hair out. But where's that balance? I appreciate the language that he uses, which is, although a clear assessment of the circumstance is important, excessive pessimism can leave people feeling not just hopeless, but also helpless. In your experience, what's the right balance? What's the balance between holding up the terrible realities that surround us and holding up a message of hope? When are we Pollyanna, and when are we faithfully hopeful? I mean, how do you find that balance? How do you find it in your own experience? How do you find it in your religious community? How do you find it in those among whom you live and work and move and have your being? How do you find that balance between reality and hope? Paul, Liz, Alan, anywhere. Yeah, Alan.
Well, and this ties into the continuing conversation. I see us living from age to age. And, there was, a lot of devastation with HIV, even here in the States. And we've moved to a place where, where it's medically manageable now. There will be all of these markers of human health and well-being. All of them can be confronted, and things will change. What is here now is going to change, and honestly, that's where my great hope lies. If we live eschatologically, as in this is the moment of Christ, then we're compelled to look for hope in this moment. Thanks.
Yes, Paul.
A couple of things. My daily devotionals lately have been about the joy that we have as Christians, or that we need to have as Christians. And that is so encouraging to read, day after day, the reminder of the joy that we need to have as Christians. The other thing is, it may be genetic, I'm not sure, but my father was a very positive person, and I think that's contributed to my outlook on life, trying to be positive or just feeling positive for the most part. I think he set a very fine Christian example for me as I was growing up.
Thank you. There's a leadership consultant that I grew up in, and his son was one of my friends, and secular, but he would consult with businesses about their sort of business model, and especially getting new businesses started. And his tagline or his slogan was "Choose to happy." Choose to happy. Yeah, thank you, Liz.
I've been called a Pollyanna before in my family, but there's always something good to look for. And so sometimes I think the way I look at life is there are some bad things that are going to happen in life, whether you like the political climate, whether it's a hurricane or whatever, but there's always something good that comes out of that. And I think the pendulum swings this way, and aren't we lucky enough to see it swing back the other way? So I think all bad things end up to something good things.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Yep, was there one in the back of the room? No. Janet, up front?
Well, so much of this for me goes back to the baptismal covenant. As a Christian, I think we choose to be in the human condition and in the human struggle. Some of us who have more privilege can step out of that. Some of us who have less privilege cannot necessarily even step out of that for a moment. So for me personally, it's a commitment to the struggle of people of color, of Arkansas building a new jail, of 287G in our community. You can say, yes, less children die every 6 seconds, but the reality is there are people suffering here, and my faith tells me to go and be a part of that and stand in that as I can and help as I can. So that doesn't go away for me.
Thank you.
With the statistics.
Yeah, is it possible? What I'm hearing is it possible the extent to which the successes we might celebrate are evidence of possibility, but the reality of suffering that still persists, and particularly that persists around us, requires our attention, but it's not hopeless. Progress can be made. Is it possible then to use a message of relative improvement to narrow our focus in the local community, or must we, or when does too much language of progress ameliorate the crisis that's still around us? Yeah. Elliot, and then Betsy.
I was going to say almost exactly what you said. The way I find that balance is a couple of things. To remember, looking at the long term, that things have always been horrible, and that they're less horrible right now. There was a book by Steven Pinker that came out a few years ago called The Better Angels of Our Nature, and he pointed out very much what Christoph is saying here. And yet you look around at worldwide, and it's a horror show in many ways. The way I deal with it is to accept that, to remember that the worst things that have happened, at least in the last century and a half, have been under the ideologies of people who said that you're able to perfect things, that whether it's the worst of communism, the worst of Mao, of Pol Pot, of Nazism, of course. We can stop history. Everything will be better. To remember that on the one hand, and on the other hand, just keep it local. To ask yourself, what can I do in my community? What can I do in my church? What can I do in my university to help things a little bit where I can see some possibility of making a difference.
Yeah, and I wonder to what extent it's about story. It's about who's able to articulate that story. I don't really know Nicholas Kristof, other than the fact that I read his op-ed pieces in the New York Times pretty regularly. But white male, cisgendered, who is well educated. He might be right in the aggregate about those improvements, but how much does that matter to those living all around it, maybe on his block, who don't have it? And how can the local story still matter despite kind of an important global story? But I love that invitation to remember that it's the illusion of perfection, or the pursuit of it, the focused pursuit of it that has gotten humanity into so much trouble. Yeah, thank you. Betsy, and then we'll move on.
Well, I was just thinking, though, that we have to remember that God does use the bad things to create progress and good things. And then I think each of us are given those little tiny pieces that help maybe move it forward just a bit. I'm thinking of the little girl who came with my granddaughter and said, I didn't get anything for Christmas. Mama didn't have any money this year. And it's just haunted me. And we'll do something about it because we love her and we know a little bit more about her circumstances. But, maybe that's all I can do. But there are a lot of people in this world, if we look around the news, who are responding. I'm thinking politically, and I'm not going to go into anything specific, but think of all the people who have responded and taken some responsibility for trying to move things forward. And so I do see God's hand in that.
Yeah, thank you. I hear a couple of things that you've said, and you remind me of a springboard that I'll take from you. One is, though, God, I heard you say something like God uses the bad things to bring something out. The question is always how, right? I mean, how? How do we see that? How do we hold on to that? And we probably get 40 different answers from the 40 or so people in the room. But the how, but the question of faith is to look for it, even if we struggle with it. I think there's a danger in a year like this one, like 2019, in which apparently the stock market is going to have one of its best years ever. It's easy to see that and forget that doesn't matter for a lot of people who still don't have jobs, whose wages aren't going up, who are stuck in poverty, who live among us, right? And so I appreciate the tone and the tenor of this particular op-ed piece because it doesn't ignore the struggles that are still going on, and it doesn't seek to sort of ask us to discount them. In fact, quite the opposite. It asks us to address them, but perhaps from a position of hope. Yeah, thank you. Let's move on to this piece. This is a piece about abuse in the church, if that's a struggle for you. We understand that, and you might want to step out or go to the restroom. I don't want that to catch you off guard. There's no graphic descriptions of abuse, but certainly a sensitive subject for us. This is is featured in our local paper by Terry Mattingly. Many of you know Terry Mattingly lives in Tennessee, but writes for a lot of papers like ours. And I'm wondering if somebody would read for us, please, the article. Let's get two individuals. Who would read the front page for us and who would read the back page for us? Front page, and let's start. Betsy, would you read front page and would you read back page for us since the microphone's already there? Thank you.
Protest rallies have been common during the Me Too era, but many of the demonstrators outside the 219 Southern Baptist Convention were quoting Scripture. As a teaching tool, they offered a large model of a millstone. That was a reference to the Gospel of Matthew, in which Jesus warns that for anyone who leads little ones astray, it would be better for him to have a great millstone fastened round his neck and to be drowned in the depth of the sea. Protesters come and go. Inside the convention center in Birmingham, Alabama, Rachel Denhollander warned Southern Baptist Convention leaders that it was past time for them to focus on the faces and stories of sexual abuse survivors in their own pews. Abuse survivors are trying to get church leaders to stop hiding abusers and the institutions that shelter them, she said. Far too often we do this in the name of unity. Don't say anything negative. We need to be unified. But, brothers and sisters, we are to be unified around the holiness of God. We are to be unified around our confrontation of sin and our confrontation of the darkness. We are to seek the light. Headlines about sexual abuse among Southern Baptists are not a surprise to survivors. What you need to understand is these men and women have been pleading with the church to hear their voices for decades, and they have been shut out over and over and over, again in the name of Christ. That's what the SBC has done to these survivors. You need to understand the perspective that they have come from. You need to feel the grief and the betrayal and the harm and the hurt they have felt. Den Hollander is best known as the first woman to speak out and file a police report of abuse against the USA gymnastics doctor, Larry Nassar. She has also played a crucial role in the Church 2 firestorm surrounding the Southern Baptist Convention after a Houston Chronicle investigation that revealed hundreds of survivors of abuse by clergy and volunteers in America's largest non-Catholic flock. Members of the Religious News Association selected the Southern Baptist Convention scandal as the top religion story of 2019. However, Den Hollander was not selected as the Religion News Association's top religion newsmaker. That honor went to the Democratic U.S. Reps, Alanoha Omar and Rashida Tlaib, who were at the center of the bitter 2019 debates about the U.S. aid to Israel.
I voted for Den Hollander as the top religion newsmaker. As my number one story, I combined several poll options to focus on the year's hellish increase in attacks on worshipers in mosques, Jewish facilities, and churches, including 250 killed in the terrorist attacks on Easter in Sri Lanka. Here's the rest of this year's Religion News Association Top 10. Number 2, a gunman linked to white supremacist blast on social media kills 51 worshipers and wounds 39 at 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand, creating a stunning video of his rampage. Number 3, a special United Methodist Church General Conference affirms the church's doctrines on marriage and sex, including a ban on same-sex marriage rights and the ordination of non-celibate LGBTQ clergy. Signs of schism increase, including a statement by Western Conference bishops offering a safe harbor for gay and transgender clergy. Number 4, in Catholic scandal news, former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick is defrocked for the abuse of boys and sexual harassment of seminarians. Buffalo, New York Bishop Richard Malone resigns after mishandling abuse cases, and a report pins financial and sexual sins on former Wheeling, Charleston, West Virginia Bishop Michael Bransfield. 5, the beloved Catholic shrine Notre Dame de Paris is heavily damaged by fire, while heroic first responders, including the chaplain of the Paris Fire Brigade, prevent total destruction. 6, old guard Christian conservatives protect President Donald Trump amid impeachment hearings, while evidence grows of tensions and splits in evangelicalism. 7, a Gallup poll finds about half of Americans have ties to a house of worship, while Pew Forum research indicates that 26% of Americans are now nuns. 8, Democrats Omar and Tlaib, the first Muslim congresswomen, are denied entry to Israel while drawing fierce online attacks from President Trump. 9, Hindu nationalists in India revoke the autonomy of majority Muslim Kashmir, while Supreme Court backs Hindus seeking a temple on the site of a mosque razed by mobs in 1992. 10, gunmen kill 1 person at a Poway, California synagogue, 2 others outside a German synagogue, and 3 in a Jersey City, New Jersey kosher market. Anti-Semitic attacks and threats increase around the world.
Great, thank y'all. Partly I want to hear what you think about the religious news of the year, but let's start with the hashtag Church2, the bit that Mattingly points to at the beginning of his article. What's your response to that? What's your response to continued news about abuse in the church, and in this case in particular, in the Southern Baptist Convention? Richard?
When I was a teenager, I was in the Southern Baptist Convention. I was a member of First Baptist Church Mountain Home, and unfortunately, the pastor there was a serial sexual abuser. They fired him when the deacons found out. They got evidence, and they had good hard evidence, so it wasn't hearsay or anything. They fired him, but we didn't get to have a discussion about it in the church. They didn't come out and say, this is what happened. My dad was a deacon in the church. That's how I found out. And actually, I initially found out from one of the sex abuse survivors in the church. Somebody who no longer attended church, and I just was casual, well, why not? And then she told me about the pastor there and what he had done to her. And I realized I'd just gotten married, and he was grooming my new wife to come and assault her also. So we didn't have any discussion about it. And it goes back to my statement earlier about credibility. If you worship a God of truth, the truth can sometimes be painful. And these are painful conversations to have, but they are necessary. You have to have them. You've got to get everything out. And that is what allows a congregation to heal, is to face it together as a community and not try to sweep it under the rug, even though you, quote unquote, did the right thing by firing the person, but the perpetrator, but we really needed to hash that out as a community.
Thank you for sharing that. Other responses to the piece? One thing I think it's worth noting, or at least where my response is it has been so easy, I think, for us to associate not only the abuse of children, but any kind of sexual harassment, sexual abuse, rape, or inappropriate conduct by ordained and lay leaders with the Catholic Church, right? Because that seems to be in the news so much. There's still an anti-Catholic sentiment in many parts of the country and in parts of the world. This is a reminder, of course, that it's not just Catholic and Baptist. It's Episcopal, it's Methodist, it's Presbyterian, it's human nature. There are predators in the human population, and they find homes in churches. And churches are places that are defined by trust and defined by safety and defined by intimacy and secrecy, defined by secrecy, thank you. And because of that, it's a recipe for tragedy, it's a recipe for abuse, it's a recipe for the propagation of that abuse. And so I certainly am not interested in pointing fingers at the Southern Baptist Convention, though that's the focus of the article. The same is true in our church as well. We're just not the second largest denomination after the Catholics, right? And so it's a reality. And I have appreciated some of the ways in which in recent years our church has attempted to address that. But of course, we still have a long way to go. This is a good reminder that in this chapter of the church's history, the Episcopal Church's history, we have changed the way we handle clergy discipline so that any allegations of sexual misconduct by a member of the clergy are no longer barred by statute of limitations, by time, for at least the next 3 years, including this one, so 2 years after this year. And so that means that if there have been individuals who have been victims of abuse, that those might be reported regardless of how long ago they were. Before that change was implemented for this 3-year period, it has always been the case, or at least it's been the case since our current disciplinary structure has been adopted, that if the allegations are about a minor, then there's no time limit to that. But in this case, regardless of who the victim is or who the perpetrator was, even if those events happened a long time ago, those can be alleged. And the way to do that is to call the diocesan intake officer. In our case, that's Canon Jason Alexander. Call him at the diocesan office. I'm happy to give you his number if you can't find it on the web, but you can certainly call that. But that's true. That's how one of the ways that our church is attempting to grapple with this more fully, but still leaves a lot to be desired. How else do you respond to this, the first part of this article, in terms of abuse within the church? Ray and then Janet?
I've paid attention to this issue for some 20 years, having been raised Catholic. And the thing that troubles me is it seems that most of the outrage and force for change comes from secular forces bearing down on the church rather than forces inside the church trying to clean up their act.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that observation. Janet, up front?
Yeah, I'm a survivor of sexual abuse in the church, in Arkansas, in the Episcopal Church, not here. But the healing, I mean, you have to focus on the healing of the church, the community, the victim, and the perpetrator. You have to focus on that healing. And if you don't talk about it, there's no healing. If you don't address it, there's no healing. Something in the Episcopal Church right now, isn't the Episcopal Church supposed to be addressing this? Like in a, is that what you said? Okay. Yeah, there was something that happened at convention last year, I believe, and so that's good. I mean, you have to talk about it. Otherwise there's no healing for anybody. And whether it's known in the church or not, it affects the congregation, it affects the community. So,
Thank you. Thank you. Other reflections on that? Yeah, thank you.
The clergy needs help, probably more than anybody else walking the street, because they're exposed to so much more that are very confidential, and they have a real tough job remaining within themselves and just staying honest and truthful to God, because they're human beings, and you can't take the duality out of the presence of God within the clergy and their human reactions and needs. It's just, there's a special breed that have become to go to the clergy, and I don't know, I have not been to any psychological classes or anything or with that, but there's a special continuing education requirement for that on an ongoing basis. And it's not just sexual predators, it's also emotional dependencies and helping where you can, and helping and finding resources for the flock that they're tending to. So it's a very strange mix, but it needs continuing maintenance from an outside source, outside the church, to keep themselves and that balance between their human reality and their special relationship with the God within them, to help them to find a balance when situations arise. It's a special education type of thing.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I can only speak from my experience, which is, of course, peculiar, but I think also statistically not a typical experience in the church, that I've almost always had clergy colleagues with whom I work, with whom I can share that. And often there are clergy people who find themselves kind of alone and carry that burden on their own. And in theory, we're given the resources to avail ourselves so that we don't find ourselves carrying that burden. I think, in my experience, the most help that clergy can get, other than people who love and support our clergy, is the kind of demystifying of who we are. I mean, we're human beings just as frail and flawed as anybody. But I think we often associate our clergy with God, as you say. And so as a result, sort of the expectations are unreal, and often clergy then project unrealistic expectations upon themselves on behalf of those around them. And so we end up sort of closing ourselves off and carrying a burden that becomes unsustainable. Thank you. Let me say one word about the way that we prevent sexual misconduct in the church, which you might be interested in knowing, and maybe it'll expose some particular shortcomings, but I invite others who are trained or knowledgeable of that to join me. Anybody in our church, and this should be true of every Episcopal church, anybody in our church who works with children or youth, works with minors, has to go through a program called Safeguarding God's Children. Some of you have participated. If you've ever taken Safeguarding God's Children, would you raise your hand? Yeah, so a fair number of us. Safeguarding God's Children is not designed to determine whether you are a predator or not. That's just silly. Instead, it's designed so all those who have participated in the training know what to watch for. So that when we see a strange adult and a strange child walking down a hallway to a less populated part of the church, we know to say, I'm sorry, can I help you? Where are you going? That it's not okay for children above the age of 2 to sit in an adult's lap if that adult is not their parent. So that we know that you can't ride in a car with a minor by yourself. You need 2 children there. And if the system is trained for that, then we know what to watch out for. And that potential predators who come into a church and say, I'd like to work here, I'd love to volunteer here, let me be a volunteer, they'll quickly find that the system doesn't allow that because we say, I'm sorry, no, you can't ride in a car with that youth, no, you can't visit that person in a home, no, you can't walk down that hallway. And so the system has its eyes open and its ears open. And I think the system works pretty well because we require everyone who works with children or youth to be trained in that and to review that training as well as to be background checked. If that's something you care about, if you'd like to be a part of that training, we can make that training available to you as well. One of the weaknesses, however, is that although there are training modules for elder abuse, for sexual harassment, sexual abuse of adults, and for some other issues, our antenna aren't up in the same way, right? So we require kind of clear boundaries, but who's to judge those boundaries? That's a weakness. You know, if it's 6 o'clock in the evening and I'm meeting with you in my office and the staff leaves, that's a problem. But sometimes we need to visit, and how do we know? And do we know each other well enough? And how do we know if we know each other well enough? And what does that look like? And so that's a challenge. And so we as a system need to be aware that clergy relationships and also lay employee relationships are ones that are defined by and marked by trust. And usually that trust is, at least in those individual cases, warranted. However, as a system, we can't trust human nature. Humans are no dang good, right? As we will prove to you over and over again. And so that healthy skepticism. So as a result, we have to talk about this. We have to share that. We have to let people know what's appropriate and inappropriate relationships with your clergy. If you have questions about that, who might you call? How might you report that? How might you even ask a question about that? If we're not making those things available to the congregation, then we miss that opportunity. And 20 years from now, we're telling a story about that person who used to work here that did terrible things, right? So we have to hold that in front of us. That's critical. And I feel like we do a pretty good job with children and youth. It's not foolproof, of course, but everybody who's a part of children and youth know what to look for. And I want us to be better about that for adults as well. All right. We're not going to get to the third article, and I regret that, but I will leave copies of it on the blue table by the door in case you want to read it, since I printed them out. It's a take on Pope Francis's message. The one bit that I wanted to read from you all is that from his Christmas speech, the Pope said, quote, "God does not love you because you think and act the right way. He loves you plain and simple. You may have mistaken ideas. You may have made a complete mess of things, but the Lord continues to love you." That sounds a lot like the Christian faith that I hear celebrated in this church as well, even though we're not Roman Catholic. I think that's just fundamental to who followers of Jesus are and what we believe. But I'll leave that by the door and hope you enjoy it. Next week during the Adult Forum, Nathan Hayden will be teaching a class on icons, especially as we anticipate the Feast of the Epiphany the next day. And I hope you'll be here next week for that. Let's close with the grace. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all evermore. Amen. Thank y'all.